So this happened in April of this year, 2018. Background: I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open, and anyone could piggyback off someone else entering with the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins or other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I go to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually started to doze off. I became aware of a noise that sounded like a clicking sound, but it sounded like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kind of zoned this out, as I was used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realized the noise was extremely repetitive and getting louder. Then I started focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly it hit me. It was coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leapt out of bed and headed to the foyer. I identified the noise right away. The lock mechanism was moving back and forth rapidly, like someone was trying to unlock the front door. I could hear that an object was inserted in the lock, and the person was jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turned around, headed to my bedside safe and unlocked it with the combination. I pulled out my .357 SIG, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber in a hollow point round. I head back to the door as I exit the bedroom, and I see the lock finally twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone came through, I would have to make a split-second reaction. I decided that if someone came through the door, I would give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they did anything other than that, or entered aggressively, I was going to shoot and ask questions later. They didn't enter, however, because I had also locked the deadbolt. When I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side were 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 were wearing hoodies, so it was difficult to make out their faces. The men had objects in their hands, but I couldn't make out exactly what. The 2 men were talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they've successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman was also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She was talking in another language. The only 2 words I can make out are apartment 250. She kept repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I started to wonder for a moment if maybe they were just drunk and had the wrong apartment number, but that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key, or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or given it to anyone. Here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere on the complex. Standing back from the door, I took a long broom handle and jabbed it hard into the face of the door, letting them know I was on the other side. They immediately stopped fiddling with the lock and took off running. I debated whether to call 911 and decided against it, unless they returned. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there, and it would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened, and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I'm proud of how I stayed calm, and I was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, though, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. Close to 10 years ago, my best mate and I scored the deal of the century. Live in our parents' recently purchased and refurbished home for cheap as chips rent, so the property wasn't considered unoccupied. Their insurance would still cover it. They were planning on selling their house in the country and moving up a bit closer to town in a year's time, but when they spotted this place, it was just perfect, so they had to snap it up. They couldn't be bothered, though, dealing with rando tenants for a year, so we were offered it. It was a lovely old mid-Victorian-style house, with a hallway running through the majority of the length on the left side. 3 bedrooms and a bathroom coming off that hallway to the right. At the back of the house was an open-plan living room, and a kitchen and a backyard. It was in an inner Melbourneian suburb, and was totally fenced in with 6-foot fence on 3 sides. The front had this cutesy white picket fence. On the right side of the property, an outdoor gravel pathway was wedged beside the bathroom walls and the fence line. It began with a gate in the front yard and ran the length of the property to the backyard. This is important later. My mate obviously scored the master bedroom at the front, with some lovely vertically opening bay windows facing the front garden and street. I had the next bedroom, with a window facing the gravel path and fence, and the third bedroom was our study. We lived here for close to 10 months in bliss. A great house, great company, and even though the area was considered a little dicey, the location was pretty stellar. One hot summer's night, we said our goodnights to each other, and I hit the hay and zonked out pretty immediately. My housemate decided to stay up in bed to read for a bit, with just her bedside light on. She was doing that for just over an hour before she heard a weird scratching on the front window of her bedroom. Initially, she put it down to an overhanging tree branch, till she realized there was no overhanging tree branch. She sat frozen in fear, blankly staring at her book for what felt like eternity, until she heard the noise again and again. Slowly looking up, she saw a man wearing a hoodie trying to force open her window, looking her dead in the eyes. She screamed, jumped out of bed, and ran straight into my room. I woke up in a daze as she was pulling my hand and whisper yelling, "You know the one," that somebody was trying to break in. She had a tendency to be a little overly dramatic sometimes, but I swear I've never seen someone look so genuinely terrified. I went to grab my phone to call the cops, but we just went completely still when we heard the distinct crunching of someone walking down the side path of the house. We both rolled off my bed onto the floor and went completely still. The crunching continued, getting closer and closer to my bedroom window. I don't know what it is about distinct sounds at night when it's otherwise quiet, but it sounded deafening. And then I realized why it was so loud. My window was wide open. I jumped up, slid the window down, and slammed the lock shut just in time for him to reach the window. He looked in at me, but didn't react at all. He just calmly tried to open the window, but when he realized he couldn't, he continued down the pathway to the backyard. I was thoroughly shitting myself now, and my housemate was sobbing on the floor, looking up at me like a bunny about to be torn apart by a fox. I sprinted to the back door to thankfully find it locked, and ran to my room and called the cops. I don't know what the cops knew that we didn't, but they must have broken a land speed record to arrive only 3 minutes later, lights and sirens off. We saw them go down the side path, guns drawn straight into the backyard. There were some noises from the yard, then a knock at the back door a moment later. The police identified themselves. Turns out the man had vaulted over the back fence, quite an impressive feat, and another patrol car was headed to the next street over to look for him. The 2 cops at our place asked if we were okay, then asked if they could come in and take a look around. The cops were honestly amazing. They managed to calm us down whilst making sure the place was safe. I was really impressed with how they handled the situation. I offered them a cuppa, which they politely declined, as they took our statements. They asked if there was anyone we could stay with tonight. My housemate and I stayed at her boyfriend's place for a few nights after that, and when we stayed in the house it was never the same. We felt completely violated, and ended up moving out a few weeks later. We never found out if the man was caught, but there was a random stabbing a few nights after the incident at a train station just 2 streets over. If it was related or not, I don't know, but all I can think is that we were so fucking lucky that it went the way it did. This is a story from my childhood, one of the ones that haunt me to this day. Have you ever seen one of those memes where it says people react like a criminal whenever an unexpected visitor arrives on their doorstep? They freeze and drop everything they're doing, throw themselves to the floor to avoid being seen in a window. This is my story of how I became one of those people. At the time, I must have been around maybe 7.5 years old. I was visiting the Midwest, Kansas to be exact, from South Korea, where I was born and raised. I was just visiting family, nothing major. On that particular night, the adults, our aunt and uncle and our parents, were going out to have a date night. So our parents had ordered us some pizza before they left and waited for it to arrive, so we wouldn't have to open the door for anyone. My aunt and uncle had 2 kids, 2 boys to be exact, and they were both ages 15 and 8. Like I said before, I was maybe 7.5 at the time. My older sister was 11, and our baby brother was the tender age of 3. So all in all, we were ready to just have a night of fun games. After all, it wasn't often the cousins got together like this. They lived in the States and we lived off in Korea, but we loved each other very dearly. We saw our parents out at the garage entryway. They made sure we knew the rules and we could recite them back to them. They also made sure we knew what the telephones were and the emergency numbers to accompany them. It's just gonna be a typical night of no parents, or so we thought. It had been an hour, maybe 2 after our parents had left. We were downstairs in the basement in the playroom, or the game room, whatever people like to call it these days. We were down there just watching movies, playing air hockey, and things of that nature. We were all just being kids. We weren't being loud or anything like that, and even if we were, it wouldn't be too big of a deal, because the way houses were in Kansas, the basements are built into the ground in case of a tornado. I had gone upstairs with my oldest cousin because I wanted to grab a drink of chocolate milk, and I couldn't reach the cups alone. We wandered upstairs into the kitchen, which was on the far end of the house. The others stayed downstairs and continued playing their games. We had been upstairs for maybe 15 to 20 minutes because while I was drinking my milk, my older cousin was making some snacks, since we were all planning to watch movies together. All of a sudden, we hear the doorbell ring. I remember my cousin looking at me and telling me to stay there, because it was odd that the doorbell was ringing. It wasn't late, but it certainly wasn't early. I say this because it was summer, and it was around 8 o'clock. My cousin started to creep towards the door quietly. It was unnerving for someone to be ringing the doorbell at night. We weren't expecting any guests, and the pizza had already been delivered before our parents had even left. Before he's even halfway to the door, whoever's on the other side starts rapidly ringing the doorbell over and over, the constant ringing echoing throughout the house. By this point, I had looked over toward the staircase, and I saw our other siblings starting to creep up the stairs, with the exclusion of the baby, who was still asleep in the crib down in the guest room. The oldest of the kids, let's go ahead and call him James from here on out, put his finger to his lips and told us to be quiet and make it seem like no one was home, despite there being lights on. He crept closer to the door as the banging and ringing on the doorbell continued, and he peeked out through the peephole. I had never seen my cousin look so freaked out. His face drained of color, and he backed away from the door rapidly. He told us all to go downstairs, but of course we didn't listen. Honestly, we all thought he was playing a joke. Maybe it was some of his friends wanting to scare us, since he had canceled plans that night to stay home and watch all of us kids. My older sister shoved her way past him and decided to look through the peephole herself. For whatever reason, whatever was on the other side of the door made her have the exact same reaction, and she stumbled away from the door just as pale. At the time, I didn't understand what was going on. I don't think any of us younger kids really did, but something wasn't right. After a while, about 20 minutes, whoever was at the door stopped ringing the doorbell, and all was quiet again. It seemed like they gave up. Maybe they just thought no one was home. If only we knew how wrong we all were. We all sat in silence for a while after this initially occurred. My other cousin, who I'm just going to call Kyle for the purpose of this story, mustered up the courage to ask his brother James, who was at the door, why James and my sister were acting so skittish. James told us that there had been a man wearing dark clothes who seemed to be carrying some kind of package or a large box. He couldn't make out his face. Of course, Kyle, being the little smarty pants he was, started to mock James, saying how he was just being a scaredy cat and didn't recognize their neighbors. Kyle was convinced it was just a neighbor trying to drop off a package that might have gotten mixed up in the mail, seeing as that sort of thing happened all the time. We all agreed that was the probable cause, until we realized that whoever was ringing the doorbell didn't leave the package on the porch, which isn't that what most neighbors would do? In the case no one answered, they'd just leave it, right? And why would they bring it over to the house in the dead of night, instead of just waiting for the next day? We all thought it was over and done with, so we pushed it to the back of our minds. We didn't think it was important to call our parents and let them know what had happened. For us, it was over, after all. We went back to the kitchen and grabbed the snacks, and started to head back downstairs, until we heard banging again. But it wasn't from the front porch this time. We were in shock. We froze in fear. It was coming from right behind us. We turned slowly and looked back in the direction from which we came from. We were currently standing in the dining room, as we had already passed through the kitchen. It was like someone was banging on the kitchen window. You know, the one that's typically above the sink, so your mother and father can watch the kids while they play in the backyard. James and my older sister, who I'm just going to call Nicole, got down on their hands and knees, and they crawled back into the kitchen, much against our charging. Just as quickly as they crawled into the kitchen to take a peek, they crawled back to us, almost in hyperspeed. They told us to all stay down and stay as low as we could, as we crawled into the den further down the hallway. James had us all huddle close to the fireplace, out of sight from all the windows. He told us to stay there. He was taking charge. He was going to protect his home and his family the best he knew how. James quickly crawled away. I didn't know where he was going, but I was scared, and the banging was getting louder. It was getting closer and closer. At some point, I started to cry, and I remember Kyle put his hand over my mouth. My sister was hugging us both tight. Around that time, we saw James starting to appear back from around the corner. He had grabbed his baseball bat. He had crawled up another staircase to get to his room. He crawled past us and put a finger on his lips again, and that's when we realized he was crawling towards the doggy door. He was attempting to close off one of the entrances to the house that wasn't locked yet. Thankfully, he managed to get it latched in time, because we don't think the man outside had realized the house had a doggy door. When he heard the lock click in place, the banging became more erratic, more violent. All of a sudden, much like before, the banging stopped, but we could all hear pacing. Someone was walking back and forth across the porch, slowly and deliberately. His heavy boots thundered across the red oak porch, and then without a warning the pacing stopped. It became quiet, eerily quiet. Then the man called out,
"Won't you open the door? I have a package for you."
We didn't respond. We stayed quiet, or as quiet as we could with the way our hearts were pounding and how ragged our breathing was. The stranger called out again,
"Open the door."
Again, we didn't answer. Then he called out angrily,
"I said open the door. I have a package."
Like before, we didn't answer. We all just stayed still. The man began to bang again, this time directly on the panel window of the room we were sitting in, yelling,
"I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Open the door or I'll open it for you."
The windows rattled and shook violently with each impact from the strange man. Thankfully, our cousin's house had reinforced windows, so they weren't easy to break. Unluckily, we didn't have any neighbors close by, so nobody would hear the commotion. But while he was making all this noise, we took the opportunity to book it to another room and grab a phone. At one point, while we were on the phone with the police officers, they asked us if we could describe the man. All we knew was that he was tall and wearing all black, so Kyle and I decided to be brave. If something did happen to us that night, at least they would have a better description of who had done it. We crawled back into the den, and we dared to look out of a small corner of the window. We gently moved the curtains out of the way, and Lord behold, the man was still banging. He had moved the shutters off outside the window. They were hanging off their hinges at this point, rattling in the wind. We both made eye contact with the deranged man, direct, soul-searching eye contact. I don't think before this night I had ever believed, but there's pure evil in the world. When I looked into that man's eyes, I swear I didn't see a soul. I know it sounds crazy, but those were not the eyes of a man. He was something unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Animalistic may be the only word I could use to describe it besides demonic. It was unnatural, and something I never want to see again. When he saw us, his smile twisted into a grin that I'm sure he thought was reassuring. He crouched down so he could get a better look at us, I assume, and then he said,
"Don't you want your mail?" "You have mail. I can give it to you, but only if you open the door."
I remember just grabbing on Kyle's hand for dear life. Kyle shook his head no and threw the curtains back over the window. Before we even had a chance to move any further, the man started violently banging on the window again. At this point, James had had enough. He passed the phone over to my sister and yelled, "Leave us alone. The police are on their way, and you're not getting in here." After that, it seemed like the man had panicked. The banging abruptly stopped, and we heard rapid footsteps on the porch. Kyle and I peeked out the window again. The man was running through the yard, past all the trees, and he jumped the fence. the wooden 22-foot fence at the end of the yard into the alley that separated the neighborhood from the old cemetery. We stayed on the phone with police until they arrived. Our parents arrived not long after, but the man was never caught. We don't know what happened after that night. He just disappeared into thin air. So this happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and I can't shake off how terrifying and strange it was. So I was home alone, getting ready for my 12 o'clock college class that morning. I opened my blinds to let some natural light in. I happened to glance out my window to see a man in his mid-30s wearing a baseball cap and roaming around on my property, his hands on his hips, and walking with a weird confidence. Our yard is kind of like a cliff, and it looks over onto our 5-acre property down below. I live in the PNW, so it's a pretty scenic view. I was pretty confused and thought maybe it had been a worker that my mom had hired for our renovations on the house, just admiring the view. I'm a little bit uncomfortable at this point, because the dude walks to the side of my house out of sight. I head upstairs to see him now roaming at my front yard and driveway, looking at things and checking out my house. He still hadn't seen me at this point. I called my dad and asked him if we had hired anyone to come by the house. He said not that he knew of, and told me he was going to call my mom and ask her, then call me back. I'm waiting for the call to arrive when I notice this strange dude's car. It's a white Honda with no license plates, just parked parallel to my front door. The dude still hasn't seen me, and he's wandering around, so I take this as an opportunity to remember that we have a security system. I armed it, so if he did try to break in, it would immediately alert the police. If this was some sort of professional or worker, he would have rang my doorbell or knocked at least once. He did neither. Just then, I get a call back from my dad, saying neither him nor my mom had hired anyone to come by today, and that I needed to call our local police station immediately. I went back downstairs after making sure to lock every door and window upstairs, and called my city's police station. I explained to a woman on the other end what was happening, and she decided she wasn't going to send an officer out. Instead, she gave me a number to call their emergency dispatch line and told me to talk to them. I called the number she gave me, and immediately I get an automated message saying, "Thank you for calling my town's name, non-emergency hotline. Nobody is available to take your call right now. If this is an emergency, please hang up and dial 911. At this point, I'm really irritated, because 15 minutes have passed, and this weird man is still lurking around my house while I'm home alone. Apparently, that wasn't enough to warrant an emergency to the lady I called at my local police department. I hung up and decided to call 911. After getting in touch with the 911 operator, I was asked a series of questions about his appearance before they would even alert officers near me to start heading toward my house. The whole thing seemed really weird. Nobody was in a hurry to have officers come up to my place, even though I was a younger girl home alone with a strange man lurking outside. I asked the officer if I could stay on the line with her, when she finally, after what seemed like forever, alerted police to come to where I was. She agreed, and I went back upstairs to check on the weird man. He was now sitting in his unplated Honda, either listening to a radio show extremely loudly, or on a phone call with someone through his car. It was a very prominent and loud male voice coming from within his car. Then all of a sudden, I heard the tone you hear when someone hangs up on you, and the operator was no longer on the line. I was really confused when my thoughts were interrupted by an unrecognized phone number calling me. I assumed it was the operator calling me back, so I picked it up right away. Instead, I was greeted by heavy, creepy breathing. I'm not sure whose it was, but it really freaked me out. I hung up immediately and dialed back 911. I had been pretty calm up to this point, but that phone call put me in panic mode. I got on the phone with another operator who already knew my situation and address before I could even explain it to her. She said the cops were already on their way. 20 minutes had passed at this point. The man was still lurking in my driveway in his car, and the cops weren't. And keep in mind, I live in a smaller town, so there's no reason why it took the cops as long as it did to come down. And finally, this dude is leaving my driveway, right as the cops pull in. They stop him and ask a few questions. A cop then comes to my door and hands me a sketchy-looking flyer saying it was just a landscaper. He said he had an appointment. I was really relieved and irritated that it was just a dude my mom had hired, until I realized it wasn't. I called my mom back and told her the cops had said it was just a landscaper she had hired, and that he said he'd made an appointment. My mom replied with, "I can assure you, we never hired a landscaper, and we don't even need one.